Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final part of our science section in the Foundations of the Bible series. Tonight, we're going to look at some of the most amazing hidden truths that the Bible revealed well before science ever discovered them. So, as we go through this, I'm going to give us a little bit of a review like we do every week. And the first thing is just to remind everybody that we came up with a working definition of science, a systematic knowledge of the physical or material universe gained by observable facts and repeatable processes.
Yeah.
In other words, our definition, working definition of science is those things that can be discovered using the scientific method.
Yeah.
I also gave a logical proposition at the beginning of this section based on our class that we did to start with on logic, in which I offered a logical argument for the Bible being different, very different than any other book, any other sacred writing, whether of ancient times or, more contemporary to us. The Bible contains information that was inaccessible through human endeavor at the time of its creation. In other words, the human beings that were on the planet at that time did not have the tools or the know-how to come up with this information on their own. The second claim is that the creator of the universe would understand every detail of his handiwork. He made it, he owns it, and he understands it.
Right.
Just like the engineer that builds the engine, they understand how it works better than anybody else.
Yeah.
Everybody else can come and study it after the fact, but only the one who designed it and put it together knows exactly how every single part of it interacts.
Yeah.
The third one is that the only way that the authors of the Bible would know this information is direct revelation from God. Since they didn't have the tools or the ability to discover these things, the only way that they could find them out was to have God explain it to them. And then finally, that leaves us with a conclusion, and that is that there is a creator who speaks to men, and the Bible is actually his word.
Yes.
So the warning was
that people that aren't going to believe aren't going to believe.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no magic bullet. The information that you receive here in this class may be true, but truth never convinces anybody who is predisposed to ignore the truth.
Yep.
And these are just some of the things that we've already discussed in the last 2 weeks. I'm not even going to read all of them here, but if anybody's watching in the future, they can go back and watch the previous 2 videos. But some of the things that the Bible discussed that was way different than other ancient religious texts was that the earth hangs in empty space, while the Hindus and Egyptians and many other ancient religions all believed that there was some animal, or in the Greeks' case, a giant that held the earth. The Bible also spoke of the stars, the sun, and the moon acting as a calendar, providing light, but definitely not deities like all the other religions believed.
Yeah.
It spoke of things like springs under the ocean that there was no way for men to find. And in fact, 18th century scientists believed that was totally impossible. Of course, now we've found many of them. Some other facts that ran counter to prevailing knowledge at the time. The Bible gave detailed information about disposing of waste, how to care for the sick, establishing the idea of quarantine, talking about the life of the body being in the blood. In other words, don't use bleeding somebody as a healing technique. That goes contrary to what we know now about the science of healing. We also talked about some more health issues. Number one, that the Bible gave us the example all the way back in Genesis of God putting Adam to sleep to remove his rib. So he gave the perfect example of doing surgery without pain. The Bible gave us a complete description of Galileo's hydrologic cycle thousands of years before he discovered it. Also gave us the information that the air itself, the atmosphere, actually has weight, when all the scientists from Aristotle up until Galileo's assistant believed that that was not true. We know from the Bible that the universe and everything associated with it had a beginning, and that time, space, matter, and energy all began at the same time. And those are all discoveries of the 20th century. We also have found out through the work of Einstein and Hubble that there was no time before creation. And Hubble's work and the use of his telescope proved that the universe is expanding and stretching out and had a beginning. And of course, the Bible uses the word that God stretched the universe in multiple places and is in the process of stretching it out. Good does it do us as Christians to know the things that the other ancient religions used to believe and teach, and also this evolving scientific process that's happened over the last couple thousand years?
Well, I think one thing that does for us is it just helps us be confident in what we're speaking of.
And the other thing is that it is definitely the contrast that gives us a really good idea about where the truth actually lies. Just like we talked about that all the way from Aristotle's time, 300 BC, until Einstein's time, where he still believed exactly what Aristotle had taught 2,200 years before that, they taught a static and eternal universe. And yet the Bible has always taught a universe that had a beginning and is expanding. And of course, now scientific thought of our day actually lines up with the Bible rather than this static universe theory. And so the contrast really clarifies how valid God's word really is. It's also interesting to know that if you get into an argument with a naturalist, somebody who claims to be agnostic or an atheist, and they start talking about the origins of the universe and, you know, the proof that they have for it, almost all of the arguments that they use come from this static universe theory. So they actually are in disagreement not only with the Bible, but with modern science. Instead of accepting the theory that most scientists now who are actually studying the universe accept as the only possibility that the universe had a definite beginning and has been expanding ever since then, they use theories that were developed under scientists who believed exactly the opposite of that. I want you to also keep in mind, and I referenced this a little bit last week, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail here, that we're talking about the evidence itself that has been discovered. When we bring up these videos, when we talk about these scientists and what they have to say, we're actually talking about the evidence that they've discovered that they now accept, but we're not accepting their theories or their conclusions. The only thing that we're doing is comparing the fact that the evidence that they now acknowledge is exactly the same thing that the Bible has been saying for thousands of years. Number one, we know that the Bible has always taught that the universe has a beginning, and science has found evidence to prove that. We also know God created everything that we see today, and it did not come by some random chance, accidentally, by some inexplicable force that resulting in nothing exploding and becoming everything. This was a whole lot more directed than that. And we have the Bible, which has been validated to be correct on all these scientific points, that also goes beyond that and tells us how it actually happened. So
But
really
this-
what we have when we're talking about these things is we have the same evidence. Both sides are looking at the same planet. We're both looking at the same universe, but we're looking through different lenses. On one side, you have the secularists who are looking through their lens of everything had to happen without God. And on our side, we're looking through the lens of biblical history, where we have revelation that we've already proven has disclosed a lot of this information way before the scientists ever figured it out. So here's a test case. If you were going to try to figure out how old you are, how would you go about proving it? Let's say you ended up, you started out your life at a very young age in an orphanage, and you were dropped off on the church steps in a basket, and you really had no idea who you were, how old you were, what year you were born, what month you were born. How could you go about proving it?
You'd start asking where you came from and then go look for the records to see that if it was documented.
Right. Yeah. Start trying to find out if there's anybody there that knew anything about you. First of all, you got to try to find, your family, at least their names.
Yeah.
Then start trying to trace back to where did they live and who knew them, and maybe they're dead and gone. But you would have to do a lot of investigation. You would have to go through a lot of records. You would have to talk to a lot of people, and you would have to find people that you could trust about it. But there's not a whole lot of information available, even if you're talking about yourself. And that's one of the problems that scientists have but don't like to admit when it comes to aging the earth and trying to figure out exactly how long it's been here, because they don't want to talk to the one who has the record. So on one hand, we have this theory, this secular theory of history, where it involves millions of years and starts out with the premise that life somehow came from non-life, and then that resulted in death, struggle, pain, disease, killing, extinction, and suffering, and somehow or other that process brought us to where we are today. It doesn't really sound like a very solid foundation. On the other side, we've got what this particular writer calls the 7 C's of history. And that is that the Bible gives us kind of a progression that went from creation to corruption to catastrophe, of course, talking about Noah, to confusion, meaning that's when all the people split apart, to Christ, and the major event of history, which is the cross, the only thing that can bring everybody back together. And then finally, the consummation, where God wraps this all up at some point. So it's a totally different way of looking at the same exact planet and the same exact evidence, because that's all we have. So it really determines what your philosophy and what your mindset is as to where you're going to conclude all of this. So let's go back and look at a little bit more scientific stuff. And today we're going to start with just the basic laws of science itself. One of the first ones that we're going to take a look at is the laws of thermodynamics. They are a relatively recent observation in the field of science, goes back about to 1850, by Rudolf Clausius, who is the one who formulated the laws of thermodynamics. And the first law that he came up with is that matter and energy can neither be created or destroyed.
Right.
It can be, the form of it can change, but it cannot be completely either created from nothing or destroyed and with nothing remains. The second law, which is also known as the law of entropy, is sometimes described as the fact that energy dissipates and everything eventually breaks down. Let's take a quick look at this video.
One day, our sun will grow so large it will swallow up the inner planets of the solar system, out as far as the Earth. It will become a red giant. For the sun, this will be the beginning of the end.
What happens is that the outer layers of the star get farther and farther from the middle. The force of gravity that they feel is getting weaker and weaker. And actually, the star loses hold of its outer atmosphere. Its outer atmosphere drifts off out into space. It expands out to become a planetary nebula. And they're some of the most beautiful objects in the universe.
Once the outer layers have drifted away, all that is left of the star is its core.
A white dwarf star is the dead remnant core of a star like the Sun at the end of its life. What's left behind is something that might weigh as much as half the mass of the Sun, but it's only about the size of the Earth. So it's an incredibly dense object. It's dead. There's no nuclear fusion going on it anymore. It's incredibly hot, but then over millions of years, it will gradually cool down to become a black dwarf.
Things have a process by which they disintegrate and eventually they cool off and are completely dead. Klaus figured this out in 1850, but the Bible described both of these laws all the way back in Genesis. Genesis 2:1-2 said, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all of the work that he had done." Right there, you see the beginning of the first law. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Once God stopped the creation process, this law became a law. Up until then, God was creating. Then it was finished. Thus, we have the first law of thermodynamics and its origin. The second law is also established by the Bible, and it says this in Romans 8:19-22. "For the creation is eagerly awaiting the revelation of God's children, because the creation has become subject to futility, though not by anything it did. The one who subjected it did so in the certainty that the creation itself would also be set free from corrupting bondage in order to share the glorious freedom of God's children." So in other words, what is the Bible saying? Creation has been subject to futility. Futility means no hope, or in the physical sense, wasting away. And it also says in verse 21 that creation itself is subject to corrupting bondage. In other words, everything falls apart. There's another verse that shows this even clearer. In Psalm 102:22-26, it says this, "In the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be discarded." Isn't that a perfect way of talking about entropy? The fact that everything breaks down, everything wears out. Hebrews 1:10-11 repeats this. "In the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment." So both of these laws are clearly stated in the Bible. So the Bible remains consistent with everything that we know of the physical world that we live in. Let's keep moving then. Let's move on into the basic building blocks of our planet. The concept of aggregates, or units of bonded atoms, i.e. molecules, trace its origin back to Robert Boyle. He was a chemist and a physicist and inventor who was born in Ireland, and he is largely regarded today as the first modern chemist. In 1661, he first hypothesized that matter is composed of clusters of particles and that chemical change results from the rearrangement of those clusters. And he wrote about this in his famous treatise, The Skeptical Chemist. Now, this was the first time that anybody had surmised that all the solid things that we see on our world are actually put together with small particles. Now, Sir Isaac Newton took his theory and went a little bit further with it. Isaac Newton was quite a guy. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a Christian theologian, and a physicist, and is widely recognized as one of the most influential scientists of all times. We talked about him a little bit last time in his theories of gravity. He wrote a book called Optics, and in that he said that particles attract one another by some force. He didn't know what force, but he said in immediate contact is extremely strong. At small distances, they perform chemical operations and they reach not far from the particles with any sensible effect. So he took it a step farther and started trying to figure out what held these little particles together. The first electromagnetic lens was actually developed in 1926. Newton started trying to figure out what force would hold these particles that no one had ever seen together. So we have 1704 to 1926, 222 years before man invented something that allowed science to prove once and for all that yes, everything was put together with microscopic particles there's no way to see. So that's how far ahead of his time that both of those guys were when they started theorizing the existence of particles and molecules. But the Bible had this to say over 2,000 years ago. By faith, we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. In other words, the Bible's telling us that everything we can see is made of things that we cannot see. God told us this before any of the scientists ever even dreamed of it. Isaac Newton had this to say when he was talking about these forces that hold things together. He said, gravity explains the motion of the planets, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things and knows all that is or can be done. And to me, that is basically the same statement that I made in my logical claim when I said that God would necessarily understand every aspect of his creation. Yep. That's basically exactly what Isaac Newton was saying. The Bible also tells us some really interesting thing about light itself. Here's a little video to get us started, to refresh your mind on some of the things that you learned in school about light.
If light is on and no one's around to see it, is anything actually lit up? Well, the ancient Greeks didn't think so. They thought vision was due to rays shot out and returned to the eye. That's not how it works, unless your name's Cyclops. It took over 2,000 years from those Greeks all the way to Einstein to figure out how we see the world. And each answer led to other questions. Is light a wave or a particle? Is it instantaneous, or does it travel at some speed? Or does it even exist independent of our perception? Through these brilliant discoveries about light, we've gradually illuminated our place in the universe. The first theories of vision came from the Greeks, who thought our eyes worked more like flashlights than cameras. And it made sense, kind of. At night, animals seem to have fire in their eyes, so why not humans too? But the nature of sight changed in the 10th century. Ibn al-Haytham had a revolutionary idea. Instead of just accepting the Greeks' explanations, he actually tested them. He set up specific situations, varied different conditions. He did experiments. Al-Haytham set up 2 lanterns outside a dark room. There was a hole in the wall. Inside the room, he saw 2 spots of light. If you cover a lantern, its spot disappeared. This reversed Euclid's idea. Our eyes don't give off light, they're just receivers. It proved light existed outside our bodies. Yeah, I know, it's obvious, but this was a huge step. But there was still a bunch we didn't understand. For most of our life experiences, light moves so fast, it might as well be instantaneous. And for a long time, that's what everyone thought. Dutch astronomer Ole Romer noticed eclipses of the moon. Io came later than expected when Earth and Jupiter's orbits were moving away, and sooner than expected when the planets moved closer. This difference was explained by the time lag for light to make up the distance. Light travels at a speed.
What did the Greeks and Romans actually believe about light? They believed that it originated within the viewer.
Right.
When you turned your eyes onto something, your eyes provided the light. Now, how long did their theories about light prevail? 1,000 years.
Until it
Interesting that the Bible also talks about this. In the book of Job, God asked him a question. And he said, "Have you any idea how big the world is? Answer me if you know. Do you know where the light comes from or what the source of darkness is? Can you show them how far to go or send them back again?" In other words, God had a totally different theory about light than the Greeks did. It took all the way to 1672 for Isaac Newton to make yet another amazing discovery, which he also wrote about in that book, Optics. He discovered that white light could be broken down into a spectrum of colors by passing it through a prism. He cataloged 7 colors that are visible to the human eye, which are contained within sunlight. But it wasn't until the 19th century, 1802, that William Herschel and John Ritter discovered that there were light spectrums beyond what we can see, both the infrared and ultraviolet ends of the spectrum. Here's a little bit of a history of how those discoveries came about.
Let's start with Isaac Newton. It is the year 1666. In a room with closed shutters, he works with a small opening to isolate a single ray of sunlight.
My design is not to explain the properties of light by hypotheses, but to explain and prove them by reason and experiment.
Mother, put out the candles, and I will show you the light as you've never seen before. The dawn is almost upon us. White light holds within itself all the colors of the rainbow. Light consists of rays that bend by different degrees, each a different color.
These colors reside in the prism. The glass provides the color.
I can prove otherwise with a second prism. If the prism made the colors, why would combining the colors make white? White light consists of rays of different color, differently refractive.
You have taken light to pieces.
And put it back together.
But once again, the Bible was way out in front of this, because also in Job, God asked Job, "Where is the way that the light is divided, or the east wind scattered on the earth?" In other words, the oldest book in the Bible tells us that light itself can be divided. So without the ability to perform these kind of experiments, thousands of years before Newton came along, how could any man know that light could be divided? Let's look a little bit here at some of the other light spectrums that were discovered after Newton's experiments.
Like Newton, Herschel used a prism to break up sunlight into its colors and measure temperatures across the rainbow. But when he put a thermometer in the dark, just past the red, it registered the highest temperature of all. He called these heat rays, but today we know them as infrared. Johann Ritter decided to test the other end of the spectrum, past the purple. There he found chemical reactions happened fastest. He called these oxidizing rays, but today we call that higher energy light ultraviolet. In the 19th century, James Clerk Maxwell finally unified electricity and magnetism. He calculated that the speed of electromagnetic waves was the same as the speed of light. Electromagnetic waves are light. Heat rays and chemical rays and visible light were all part of the same beast, the electromagnetic spectrum. A continuous gradient of waves, all made of the same stuff, extending out beyond each end of the tiny sliver we can see.
In 1885, the German physician Heinrich Hertz sought to experimentally verify Maxwell's electromagnetic theory and to popularize it since it was still poorly understood. He passed a high tension current through an electric circuit of breakers, two small metal spheres placed a few millimeters apart. The charges accumulated in the circuit until a spark jumped. Hertz observed that another spark jumped simultaneously several meters away in an antenna in the shape of a loop. Energy had been transmitted from one circuit to the other without the aid of a conductor wire. What had transported it? Hertz had the answer. It was an electromagnetic wave, a wave that has the same properties as light. Thus, the spectrum was added to with Hertzian waves, later called radio waves, when the first radio sets appeared.
From humble beginnings in Greece and the Arab world, over 2,000 years, we've learned a lot about how we see the world and made the universe bigger and smaller in a lot of ways.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
But if you want your mind blown, look what else God said in the book of Job. He said, "Can you send forth lightnings that they may go forth and say to you, here we are?" You see, this is right along the discoveries that light, electricity, and radio waves are all part of the light spectrum. And God told Job that light could be used to send messages. Before anybody had ever even conceived of the idea of radio, God was telling mankind about a spectrum of light that had never even been conceived of, much less discovered. And it wasn't until after Hertz made these experiments and then they were followed up on that they began to understand that you could use the light wave spectrum to send information not only from one room to another, but around the world. And now you carry them in our pockets where we can transmit videos just like we're doing right now, using the light spectrum. Let's go back and just take a look at that one small verse. God asked Job, where does light come from? Number one, that implies that light itself is separate from us. The second thing that it implies is that light travels.
Yeah.
The third thing that he says about light is that it can be divided or separated. We know that to be a fact as well. He also says that lightnings, meaning electricity, can be sent out to deliver messages, which of course is the foundation of the society we live in today. So these are some of the most important facts in the modern world. They actually originate in the oldest book in the Bible that was written over 4,000 years ago. Don't we serve an amazing God? So let's go back to our ancient books of different religions and take one quick contrast again to see what they have to say about some of these issues. The Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, and the Upanishads consider that all the objects and phenomenon of nature that we're surrounded with are all animate and divine. This includes the sun, moon, earth, rocks, everything. Writers of the Buddhist canon also ascribe life to numerous non-living objects, such as the sun and moon, lightning, rainbows, everything. Taoist and Confucian writings also contain these same errors. Now, the interesting thing is that the Quran, the Muslim writing, was written 1,500 years later, 1,500 years after these Hindu writings and the Bible, and came from around 700 AD. So by that time, many of these, what we would call now superstitious ideas, are not contained within the Quran. However, it still makes some pretty blatant errors when it talks about the physical world. It says specifically that the heavens contain lamps or stars whose main purpose is to be darted at the devils. And Muhammad himself said that the sun sets in a sea of black mud. Once again, not exactly consistent with the physical world. So knowing what some of these other religions have said about the stars and the moons and so forth, let's take a look at some of the things that we know about astronomy today and how the Bible parallels that information. Remember Ptolemy, he was the one that did all the mathematical formulas to try to prove Aristotle's theory that the Earth was the center of everything and the planets did loop-de-loops around it. He had some interesting ideas about stars. One of his was that he spent his life trying to count and name all the stars that he could see. And he managed to get to 1,022. The funniest part of this is that for many years, 1,000 years after his time, scientists claimed that there were only 1,022 stars, even though you can see 5,000 of them. Because if Ptolemy didn't name them, they didn't exist. In the 17th century, with his invention, the telescope, Galileo was one of the first men in human history to actually see beyond those 5,000 stars and glimpse the immense nature of our galaxy, because that's about as far as he could see. If you remember, it said that his first telescope magnified things about 30 times.
Right.
That's about the strength of your average rifle scope now. 30 times what you can see with the naked eye. So in his day, Galileo was able to see orders of magnitude more than anyone before him. Today, astronomers estimate that there are 10,000 billion trillion stars. That's a 1 followed by 25 zeros. However, scientists also admit that they may be on the low end. We go back to the Bible again. The Bible says, and the host of heaven cannot be counted by men. And just as the sand of the sea cannot be measured, so I will multiply the descendants of David. God told mankind that there were way more stars than you could see. Because at the time, you could probably see the visible stars much better than we can today with all the light pollution.
Right.
And when it got dark at night and it was a clear night, you had a pretty good view of that sky. But God said, there's more than you can count. But the interesting thing is that God also caps it at the other end. They're not infinite. Psalm 147:4 says he counts the number of stars and calls each one by name. So there are more than we can count, but definitely they're not infinite. Once again, that completely goes along with what science has told us today. Centuries before the telescope existed, when stars were only visible to the naked eye, the Bible declared what only God and the angels knew, that every star varies in size and intensity, and I would also add color to that. 1 Corinthians 15:40 and 41 says each one is very different from all the others. The sun isn't like the moon isn't like the stars, and each star is different. Until we had these massive telescopes, there was no way that mankind could know that the stars, especially those little tiny ones that you can barely see and all the ones you can't see, were every single one different from the rest. Now we know. So if you remember the story of Job himself, why was he having this conversation with God? Well, it's because Job was part of an experiment. The devil wanted to attack him. God said, he won't leave me if you do. And in the process, he lost all of his wealth. He lost his children. His wife left him. He was in excruciating pain from sores. He was sick. And eventually, he basically said, God, you're not fair. And so God came down and they had a conversation about that. And in that conversation, God asked him a bunch of questions, including the ones we've already looked at. Do you know where light comes from? Do you know how big the earth is? And he also asked him this particular question about some stars. God said, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season, or can you guide the great bear, the word is Arcturus, with its cubs? So we're going to take a look at 3 of these heavenly bodies in this paragraph here and find out exactly what kind of information that God revealed in this one short verse. If you're not already an astronomer, you might not know that much about these particular stars. So let's take a look and see. Let's start with the Pleiades. The Pleiades are 7 visible stars and a whole lot more that we cannot see with the naked eye. Here's a little quick video to give a little bit more information about the things we know about them.
Well, this is one of my favourite images of one of my favourite Messier objects. This is the Pleiades, or Seven Sisters, Messier 45, and it's a beautiful object to look at. It's really easy to locate this object in the night sky. You just find the belt of Orion, follow the belt stars up and to the right. They point to a bright orange star, which is Aldebaran. Keep the line going, and eventually you end up at the Pleiades open cluster. On a dark autumn winter night when the cluster is above the horizon, it really vies for your attention. It's a bit like diamonds scattered on black velvet. That's the way I always describe it. With the naked eye, if you stare at the Pleiades, that's when things start to get quite interesting, because Seven Sisters probably gives away how many stars you're supposed to see there.
The ones you can see with the naked eye tend to be, there's 6 pretty bright ones and 1 which is borderline in terms of whether you can see it or not. And right now, the reason the Pleiades is what we call a refraction nebula is it's passing through a region of dust and gas. You can see, hopefully, around, certainly this one here, this is Merope, this kind of wispy material. It's kind of almost a ghost-like image. And so this is where the light from the star is kind of hitting bits of dust, and it's then being scattered off that dust towards us.
I didn't see any gas when I was using your
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't see it unless you had a long exposure photograph. Naked eye visibility doesn't show it, but if you do the right exposure for the long enough time, you can pick out that nebulosity.
So it's a very beautiful collection of stars. The interesting thing is that there are 7 stars that we can see with the naked eye, but there's actually an additional 243 stars that are part of this group. We can't see them without telescopic help. The one thing that scientists and astronomers have discovered is that this group of stars is moving together as if they are completely locked in place with each other. Dr. Robert J. Trumpler of the Lick Observatory reported that over 25,000 measurements of the Pleiades stars are available. And it has proven that the whole cluster is moving in a southeasterly direction. The Pleiades stars may thus be compared to a flock of birds that are flying together to a distant goal. So this leaves no doubt that the Pleiades are not a temporary or accidental collection of stars, but they are an entire system or cluster in which the stars are bound together. And what was it that God said to Job? Can you bind the Pleiades? This was absolutely impossible to know without the aid of the telescopes that have only been around for the last 100 years or so. So when God asked that question, he was asking Job, can you keep them bound together so that they remain as a family or a cluster moving together forever? So the incredible thing to me about this, though, is that we have 250 stars or suns, 243 of which you don't even know exist with the naked eye, that are ordained by God to move together in a symmetrical way throughout eternity. Yeah. So once again, this is hidden scientific knowledge revealed by God in his word. Remember that silly article that we read from the Washington Post where somebody made the claim that no religious writing has ever revealed hidden truth.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have discovered a whole lot of hidden truth that is concealed in the Bible, just waiting for us to discover it.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next one. Now we're getting into this whole constellation idea that we just spoke about. So here's what we know about Orion. First of all, we know that God asked Job, can you loose the belt of Orion? Well, the belt of Orion, if we go back here, that's those 3 stars that are in a perfectly straight line, right? This is the interesting thing. Garrett P. Serviss, who's one of the most famous astronomers, wrote about the belt of Orion in his book called Curiosities of the Sky. He said this, at the present time, this band consists of an almost perfectly straight line, a row of second magnitude stars about equally spaced and of the most striking beauty. In the course of time, however, the 2 right-hand stars, Mintaka and Analam, will approach each other and form a naked eye double. But the 3rd star, Alnitak, will drift away eastward so that the band will no longer exist. How did he figure that out? With mathematics and a very powerful telescope. But God said, can you loose the belt of Orion? There's Garrett P. right there with one of his early telescopes. So this is what we know. The stars that we see that form this belt are like 3 ships that are out on the sea and that happen to be in a straight line while we look at them. But in the future, they will be separated by thousands of miles of ocean. All the stars at this present time constitute this band or this belt are all headed in different directions, and they're all journeying to different corners of the universe, so that these bands are being dissolved just as God said. I have seen several things from different astronomers saying that these particular stars, the mathematics, make it appear that the motion that these stars are involved in dates back about 4,000 years, right about the time that God said, can you loose the belt? Here's the third, and I think the most astonishing information about these stars that God mentioned. This is Arcturus, which translates to the bear. God finished this paragraph by saying, can you guide the great bear, Arcturus, with his cubs? Garrett P. Serviss also gave us some facts about this star, Arcturus. The first thing that he discovered was that Arcturus is huge. It is thousands of times larger than our sun. He also discovered that Arcturus is classified as a runaway because they've measured it and its speed is absolutely unbelievable. Our sun travels at a speed of about 12.5 miles per second, but Arcturus has been measured at traveling 257 miles per second. The thought of that is just staggering.
Yeah.
According to Garrett, It could only be stopped by a collision head-on with another body of equal or greater mass. In other words, if it ran into a smaller star, it would plow right through it and keep going. Another very famous astronomer named Charles Burkhalter, who was the founder of the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, also served as its president from 1896 and again in 1909. He also was the director of the Shabbat Observatory for 38 years. This guy had quite a history in the field of astronomy. Here's a little view of this observatory that he helped to create. Isn't that something? This is somebody who really knew his stuff when it came to astronomy. This is what he had to say about Arcturus. He said its high velocity places Arcturus into a very small class of stars that apparently are a law unto themselves. To speak plainly, Arcturus is a runaway. Newton said that the velocity of a star that's under control is not more than 25 miles per second. But Arcturus is going 257 miles per second. Therefore, the combined attraction or gravity of all the stars that we know of could not stop it or even turn him in his path. Dr. Burkhalter himself was a self-proclaimed agnostic, but somebody told him about this text in the book of Job. So he studied it, and this is the statement that he made that attracted worldwide attention. Burkhalter said, "My study of the book of Job and its comparison with the latest scientific discoveries has brought me to the matured conviction that the Bible is an inspired book and was written by the one who made the stars." Isn't that amazing? Just this one little paragraph had that kind of impact on him, because he knew there was no way that men 4,000 years ago could have understood this information without help. The funny thing is, though, that God doesn't only mention Arcturus, but the verse actually says, "Can you guide the great bear with his cubs?" With what we know about Arcturus today, with the fact that it is so huge and moving at such a great rate that it is creating a gravitational field that as it sweeps past other systems, it's actually grabbing stars out of those systems and pulling them along with it. At this point, unseen by the naked eye, Arcturus is pulling 52 other stars along with it. They are called the Arcturus stream, or as God said, its cubs.
You're right. Isn't God amazing? Amen.
We know that Arcturus and its cubs are classified by these scientists as a runaway, a star that seems to be out of sync with all the others as far, it's moving faster, it's going off on its own direction. It doesn't seem to be, a part of any particular galaxy. It's just on its own, streaming through the universe. So the question is, why doesn't it crash into other stars or planets? And where is it going? The only thing we know is that God knows.
Mhm.
But I can tell you one thing, it's not a runaway, and
No.
it won't randomly crash. The reason is because God says he's guiding it.
Mhm.
Yes.
And he asked Job, can you do that? Job said, I put my hand over my mouth.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that there's a lot of people, even some Bible scholars, that try to write off Job as some sort of Old Testament mythology. There are even people that claim to be Christians that say, well, Job was just, it's an analogy. It didn't really happen. It's a story that God put in there, to kind of, encourage people to deal with loss and all that kind of stuff. But it's funny because Job contains some of the most accurate scientific information of any of the books in the Bible.
Mhm.
Those little tidbits are scattered all through the entire Bible, but Job has a tremendous number of them.
right.
And we know that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, which places it at about 4,000 years ago. So the real question that we have to deal with is, does the Bible stand apart from its contemporaries, like the Hindu or Buddhist writings, or the Egyptian things, or some of the other ancient Chinese myths that were written down? Or how does it fare when you compare it to modern things like the Quran? I think that what it says is that it does stand apart, and there is proof beyond a shadow of a doubt about that.
Mhm.
And it contains it within itself.
Mhm.
There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that only the God that made everything could have revealed all of this information to people who would not have had a clue otherwise. So I believe that the logical proposition that I started with at the beginning of this 3-part series has been validated. I think it is sound, it's valid, and it is proven. And that proposition, once again, is that the Bible contains information that was inaccessible through human endeavor at the time of its creation. The creator of the universe would understand every little detail of his work. And the only way that the authors of the Bible would know any of that is to have that spoken to them from God. Therefore, we know without a shadow of a doubt that there is a God, there is a creator, and he speaks to men through his word, the Bible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And we also are going to find out that it's not just scientific facts that validate the proposition, because there is also other historical and prophetical issues in the Bible that do exactly the same thing. So starting next week, we're going to move from science into fulfilled prophecy and show how that begins another layer of biblical proof.